Good morning, everyone, and welcome on this hot, hot morning. We're very lucky this morning at the festival to have as our guest Edward Wilson. Can you all hear me from up there? Good, good. Once upon a time, I went into the Aldeburgh bookshop and where lovely Mary James and Johnny operate, and I said to Mary, because she's a great reader as well as bookseller, Mary, I need a really good thriller. And she said, you need Edward Wilson. 8 books later, and it wasn't that long in my life, I came out the other side and I'd had an extraordinary experience, not only from a Suffolk perspective, but generationally from my own perspective. Edward has written a series of thrillers which really start sort of after the Second World War and take one through the 50s and 60s, and also the 70s, because he finishes, or not finishes, but the Falklands comes into it as well. And this extraordinary series of novels really tells the story of our lives in the most intriguing way, but it is in the form of spy fiction. And so we're very honoured this morning to have Edward here. Edward, you began life as an American, didn't you?
Yes, in the Fells Point, Baltimore. Baltimore. We don't pronounce the T in Baltimore.
Baltimore. And you came from a military family, and you were trained in special forces.
Yes, because it came from a poor family, even though we were officer class. But anyway, so there wasn't any money in the family to educate us. So my 2 brothers and I both went to university on the military scholarships. One of my brothers went to the Naval Academy, Annapolis, and he's the longest serving naval officer in the history of 50 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And your father, he was in the forces as well, was he?
No, my father, like Catesby, my mother was a bar girl, and my father was a merchant seaman, who I never met. I never met my father because he died when I was 7 months old. So there's a bit of autobiography in Catesby.
And when you completed your training, unfortunately, things had developed in Southeast Asia, and you were packed off to Vietnam at the age of
22. I was an old man. Yeah, 22.
And how long did you serve there?
1 year. Yeah.
1 year. And that was, in a way, the most significant year of your life, wasn't it?
Yes, but yeah, it was useful for my novels because of the type of unit I was in. I would say the interesting thing about being in U.S. Special Forces, I hate it. It isn't the SAS. Totally different from the SAS. We were trained to do the same thing that the Special Operations Executive did during the Second World War. We were trained, actually, to be dropped into Eastern Europe behind advancing Soviet lines and to meet up with partisans and to carry out sabotage and that sort of thing. And then, so I think I was probably in the last group that was actually trained for this. And then we were shipped off to Vietnam, and we had to sort of do it was a completely different from what we had been trained to. Yes.
And once you'd done your year, did you then leave the forces, or did you do some time in America? What happened?
Well, no, I had 2 years remaining in my contract, but because this was 1970, and the Special Forces was the first unit to be pulled. Was the first unit in Vietnam and the first unit to be pulled out. And I was effectively made redundant. Yeah.
And tell us about what happened then, because you said you moved to Germany to cope really with the PTSD of your experience.
Yes, I mean the thing about PTSD. It's not just the horror of seeing the dead bodies and the limbs and everything blown off, but it's coming down from a constant adrenaline high. I mean, we were talking about people actually do become war junkies. They become addicted to this, this constant adrenaline flow. And also the responsibility. At the age of 22, I commanded 350 men. and then, to come back to the States and say, some of the job center says, would you like to retrain as an insurance salesman? And this is just so, so insulting. And I couldn't deal, with life in the States. And and I had a friend who he had a family friend who was building an oil refinery in Wilhelmshaven. And he says, why don't you go there and he'll give you a job. So I went to Wilhelmshaven and I found it totally boring, a backwater. But I went to, fell in love, or sort of a bit fell in love with the North German town of Bremen. And that's where I spent a year and a half. And I didn't know a word of German. I learned German working auf dem Schiffbau for AG Wiese. I was a laborer building super tankers. And that was, it actually, I probably made more money. It took years before I made as much money because of all the overtime. And then when my German was good enough, I went back to the Arbeitsamt and said to the Beamte, the official there, and I said, I want another job. I've had enough of this of the shipyard. And I handed him a letter of recommendation I had from the woman who was head of a mental hospital where I'd worked in my holidays as an assistant nurse. And being an assistant nurse in a closed ward in a mental hospital is basically restraint techniques that don't injure the patient and don't injure yourself if you're lucky. And the only word he understood in this, you could see him getting out his Wörterbuch and looking it up, the only word he understood was nurse. And he thought I was a fully qualified nurse. And he sent me to a urology clinic. And I said, Christ. And they handed me a catheter. And they said, what am I supposed to do with that? And when they said, you're making fun of me, aren't you? So I ended up, my German becoming fairly good, and I sort of learned words like Jorinka, Täterverbindungsschlauch, which you won't find in an A-level course, doing very, very responsible thing. And once I had to monitor a patient who was having a partiale narcose. I don't even know what the English word is, partiale narcose, because the blood can suddenly drop, and and his blood pressure went from 150 to 20 in about 15 seconds. And I shouted out to the doctor in the next room, "Der Patient ist kaputt gegangen." And he thought that was so funny, he couldn't get the adrenaline drip in. But the patient survived.
Thank God for that. So how did you end up? How did you end up writing novels in Suffolk?
Well, I started my first novel at Nongsan in January 1970, and it took me. It wasn't published. That was A River in May, and it wasn't published in 2002. So that was quite a long 1970. Yeah. Anyway, I ended up in Suffolk. I've been here 50 years and have no desire to go anyplace else. I love Suffolk. I ended up sort of because I needed a job after I left the army, and I decided I wanted to be a professor of English literature. So I got in to Edinburgh University to do a postgraduate course, and this is really awful what happened. And I got there, and I was going to be on GI, veterans educational benefits, and I thought this would see me to a PhD or something, and they wouldn't give them to me. And I rang up, the consul, the U.S. consul in Edinburgh. And I said, why can't I get this enhanced benefit due to veterans? And he said, because it's only available for people studying in the United States. And he said, ain't an American university good enough for you? And I thought, I've just been through all this shit of Vietnam, and I get told that. And I just want to say, yeah, what about all the GIs that landed on Omaha Beach and ended up going to the Sorbonne after the war? And and that's one of the many things actually turned me against America. So anyway, there I was. Sorry, so I'm going on too much. And then I ended up needing a job. I managed to do about a couple of terms at Edinburgh University on my savings from the Schiffbau. And then so I started applying for jobs. And the only place without a UK teacher's qualification, the only place I could get a job would be in the College of Further Education, where they'll take anyone, obviously. Because I ended up sort of teaching what was called liberal studies to craft apprentices, to plumbers, and people like that. Doing trades courses. And what happened? I had an interview at Lowestoft College, and this changed my life. I got on the train at I get emotional about this, Norwich Station, and the Lowestoft train. There's a line from Philip Larkin, which is sky and water in Lincolnshire. To me, it was sky and water in Suffolk. Yeah. And I fell in love with this place on that train.
And it's extremity.
And I've never left.
Yeah.
It's 25 years at Lowestoft College. No, 20 years, can't remember.
Well, you write, it's interesting because you write so movingly, not just the framework, which you call docu-fiction, but very beautifully about Suffolk. And so one can tell right away how it's in your soul. Let's talk about Spies and Suffolk, because I remember, again, probably Johnny James saying to me in Aldborough that there have been 6 former heads of MI6 and MI5 living there. Why does spying and Suffolk connect, particularly in the post-war history? What happened?
Well, I think, it's a lonely, isolated place where the locals keep to themselves and expect you to keep yourself too. And I think that the reticence of the local population, the rural isolation, and I just think it's a place where an ex-high-level spy somehow feels safe.
But quite a lot happened, didn't it, in Orford and just off Orford during the war? It was used a lot for all kinds of intriguing but quite secret things.
Yeah. Well, what happened, this is the great thing about being an author, is you nick other people's ideas and don't feel any guilt about it whatsoever. And I had my River in May, my much acclaimed autobiographical novel about being in Vietnam, which I just, that was what you call it when you, exorcism, that was exorcism. And then I wanted to write, I didn't want to write spy thrillers, I wanted to be a literary writer. And then I wrote a literary novel and my agent threw it away. And then then this my pal from Lowestoft College popped around one day and said, "You want to come with me to Orford Ness?" So Orford Ness was an atomic research facility, opposite Orford, and this guy John took me there, and and showed me around, and it really, they did have nuclear weapons they were experimenting with in Suffolk on Orford Ness. Look at Orford Ness. Look at the pagodas. What is the purpose of those pagodas? So if there's a nuclear explosion, all the roof and the concrete falls down and stops the fallout from spreading over the rest of East Suffolk.
And that was because post-war, the British government were obsessed with having an independent nuclear deterrent. And one's read C.P. Snow and all of the kind of political decision-making around it. But what's so intriguing about your novels is this one particular novel focuses around the spies involved in all of this. And of course, in that sense, you get the sense that the US and the UK are not as one on this subject.
Absolutely not. I've delved into this very deeply. The special relationship is special in the sense a marriage between an abuser and an abusee is special. That's how the relationship is special. One of the things that happened, the United States regarded Britain as an aircraft carrier for American nuclear weapons. And the last thing that the US wanted was the UK to have an independent nuclear deterrent, because this could create a situation whereas if there is a nuclear war, a limited nuclear war of escalation, the first nuclear bombs would have felt here, right here in Suffolk, on the American base at Mildenhall. That's where they would have gone. Then the Americans would have replied by taking out a Warsaw, say, and then the thing would have escalated a bit and then died down. Now, what happens if the UK has their independent nuclear deterrent, not dependent on Washington? Bombs fall on Suffolk, say goodbye to Moscow. And the Americans didn't want the UK to have that option. And that is why in The Envoy, the novel set on Orford Ness, you have the head of the CIA chief of station buys a boat and goes up and down the River Oar and Ord trying to spy on what's happening on Orford Ness.
And these books are filled with the United States spying on the Brits and the Brits spying on the United States. And it's absolutely gripping. We move on a little bit to the Harold Wilson era.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And that's absolutely startling. I remember as a little boy, some major who was a neighbour of my parents saying to me, "One day, young man, you'll discover why Harold Wilson resigned." And he said it with a sort of super confident look on his face. And your novel about Harold Wilson's reign is absolutely gripping because, in a way, the people who most punish Wilson's government are the United States.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And why do they do that?
Well, they did it it began in 1947 or 48. Britain was in a terrible state. By the way, people forget, rationing carried on to 1953. Post-war rationing was more strict than rationing during the war because they didn't need to keep up morale. And, the winter of 47 was awful. I mean, Britain was literally on the verge of starvation. And so what London said to Washington, you chaps fancy buying our state-of-the-art Rolls-Royce jet engines? And Washington said, you have an obligation to give them to us for free as a result of the treaty we signed. Yeah, the Lend-Lease Treaty. By the way, one of the things that I tell flag-waving Americans is, while Luftwaffe bombs were raining down on London, Wall Street was investing in Hitler's Germany. Almost, particularly Trump's father. Trump's father almost went to jail for it. And the Bush family, they continued investing after Pearl Harbor until they were pulled up. Anyway, so the idea was Britain desperately needed money, and the Attlee government, with the permission of the military, said go ahead and do it. They sold 50 Rolls-Royce state-of-the-art Rolls-Royce jet engines to the Soviet Union for an enormous amount of money. Well, the Russians, of course, reverse engineered them, and that 50 jet engines quickly turned into 500 or 1,000. and then the jet engines and these Russian MiG fighters were a couple of years later shooting down American planes over Korea, and this didn't go well between the two countries.
And Wilson wouldn't join in the Vietnam War, which
Yeah, he wouldn't join in the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but in one of my books, I thought there's a marketing thing, that never happened. I always thought since these Russian MiG fighters, which were being flown by Russian pilots in Korea, although that wasn't widely known, I think the deal selling the jet engines to them, they should have had the Rolls-Royce logo on the MiG fuselage. I mean, I think that was very unfair.
But in a way, Wilson's entire term of office, he was under threat from the US establishment, and particularly the US intelligence establishment, who was so angry that both the Rolls-Royce engines and Vietnam, that Wilson wouldn't take part. That the more crazy people in the intelligence community basically thought he was a Soviet spy.
Yes. Oh, because the guy, what's the guy's name? Yeah, that ended up spy catcher.
Oh yes,
Peter
yes.
Wright, spy catcher. Yeah, they had these ideas, absolutely mad ideas. That, the great one was Hugh Gaitskell, who was sort of the Keir Starmer of his age, who was sort of a middle of the road, right of centre late Labour leader, died suddenly in January '63. Just the same year that Kennedy was killed.
It's quite a young man too.
Yeah, he's quite a young man. He died suddenly, and the rumor was that a Soviet spy had done Hugh Gaitskell in so that Harold Wilson could become leader of the Labour Party. And this was widely perpetrated but largely by Peter Wright, which was absolutely stupid because the odds-on favourite to become head of the Labour Party was a George.
I like a drink Brown.
Yeah, George. I like a few drinks Brown. Yeah. And he was odds-on favourite, who was probably to the right of a Gaitskell. So it was. Because I think Dennis Healey entered the race, and unexpectedly Harold Wilson became prime minister. But the Wilson plot, right? I want to disguise who told me this, but let's say I was at a dinner party, sitting between a recently retired, high-ranking British military officer, very high-ranking indeed, and his wife, whose name was Lady. Well, when I called her Lady, her first name, she said, "Don't call me that. Call me just that." And I said, "Well, I'll call you La Generalissima." Anyway, so. And the Generalissima, the wife of this high-ranking officer, said to me, "And tell me, what is your latest novel about?" And I said, I had a few drinks by then. I said, "It's about the planned military coup against Harold Wilson." And she flushed with pleasure and said, "Oh, how interesting! We knew 3 of the people involved."
And in a way, we were saved from it happening, actually, by Mountbatten surprisingly walking out on the idea.
Yes, and I wonder if the Queen had something to do with it as well.
Yes, yeah.
Because even though I'm, sort of left of centre politically, I'm not a what do you call them, a Republican, and the Queen always gets a good coverage in my books. I like it when she gives Catesby his OBE. She's absolutely has a fit of giggles, thinking, who could imagine a queen of the UK giving it OBE to someone named Catesby. Because he was it wasn't Guy Fawkes. Catesby was.
Catesby was the other one in the Guy Fawkes.
Yeah,
yes.
he was the who was a. But Guy was the only one they captured alive. Catesby was shot down in Staffordshire, clutching an icon of the Blessed Virgin as he died of his wounds.
You say somewhere I read, I like to examine people caught up in a mess, not just of history, but of their own lives and choices. And I'm intrigued because although the framework to your books is, our political story over the last few decades, and that alone is intriguing, I think what makes your novels so compelling is this complexity of choices, and complexity of choices that spies have to make. Your American spy based in the UK, Kit Fournier, who features very regularly, actually betrays his own country because he's so appalled by what his own country is up to. And it betrays his own country, and the Brits turn him, don't they?
Yeah, they and send him to the Falklands for most of the rest of his life on an uninhabited island, where they debrief him every 6 months.
I think what so intrigues me about these characters, though, and about these stories, is I'm sitting there going, is this true? It's surely not. Is this true? So how do you do your research? Do people come to you on the basis of these novels, and people who want to tell things perhaps that they shouldn't, or they're feeling a little indiscreet because they want to see it out in the public world? Or how do you find out what's really been going on?
I can't tell you that. I don't want to be let out in handcuffs.
No. But therefore, you're reassuring me that the political framework of the novels I read is, as far as you're concerned, the truth.
Yes, I do think if you really plunge in and do a lot of research, and there are, there are books which have dealt, gone into this. I mean, there's several books about the Wilson plot. Which
and you also talk in one of the novels about the Peruvian peace plan in the Falklands, and how just at the moment when peace was about to be declared, our lovely Prime Minister decided to take out the Belgrano.
This is an interesting story. When that book was launched at Hatchard's, right, in whenever it was, and I looked out into the audience, and who should be in the audience but a former head of the secret, the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee, who was also Britain's last ambassador to the Soviet Union. And I looked at him, Sir Roderick, I looked at him and thought, I know how Shakespeare would have felt if when Hamlet was debuted, he looked out into the audience and saw a real Prince of Denmark. And anyway, so we had quite a long conversation afterwards. But what happened? Well, first of all, Thatcher ignored all the intelligence coming out of South America. And the final straw, the incredibly stupidest thing probably any prime minister's ever done, she recalled the Endurance. The icebreaker was the Union Jack flying in the South Atlantic, the icebreaker Endurance. And she recalled it to be scrapped. And she was also planning on scrapping half the Royal Navy surface fleet. And of course, the Hunter in Argentina were going, great, go for it, Maggie, go for it. And the Endurance being withdrawn was the final straw where they decided to do it. And okay, and then she of course realizes after these mistakes are made, her political future is dependent on getting those islands back, and sends the task force south. Now, this is fascinating. And Sir, Sir Roderick, said, "Oh, the message didn't get through," but I don't know whether the message got through. But the president of Peru and had got to Galtieri and said, "You've got to accept this peace plan. If you don't accept this peace plan, there's going to be war, and you're going to get slaughtered by the British because their military is so much more modern, and their soldiers are actually probably a lot braver than yours." So they knew they were facing, the Argentines knew they were facing a losing battle. And at midnight, between the 1st and 2nd of May, the Argentines accepted the Peruvian peace deal, which really was a surrender in anything but name. I mean, it was a surrender. There'd be peacekeepers in the Falklands for 3 months, and then if an agreement wasn't reached, it would revert to how it was before the invasion. Anyway, so what happened? This is actually Tam Dael, who I met at the Edinburgh Book Festival a number of years ago, is now no longer with it. He was obsessed with this, much more obsessed, I think too obsessed with it. On the 1st of May, the Belgrano was heading full speed ahead towards the British task force. Full speed ahead, guns primed. 1st of May 1982. The captain of the British submarine, which I can't remember the name of, the captain of the British submarine surfaced and said, "I've got the Belgrano in my sights. Can I have permission to sink her?" And permission was denied on the 1st of May. Permission was denied to sink the Belgrano. Peace treaty, more or less down and dusted, midnight. The next day, the Belgrano was retreating full speed ahead back to Argentina. And this time, the commander of the submarine, what was it called?
I've forgotten.
The commander of the submarine was giving orders to sink the Belgrano, which was in withdrawal because it had been ordered, because of the Peruvian peace deal, it had been ordered back to port. And then, of course, a 300 brave British lads were killed, and about 700 Argentines were killed, and God knows how many have died of PTSD-related suicides. And also, one of the ironies is, never mentioned when Thatcher did her triumphant, thing about the victory in the Falklands. She never mentioned 3 civilian female women Falkland Islanders had been killed by British naval gunfire. Their names were never mentioned in any of the memorial tabs. And of course, Thatcher didn't want the soldiers who had been crippled, blinded, weren't allowed to participate in the victory parade.
So, I think you might want to have a question or two yourselves, because we've only got 10 minutes to play with. We've got a microphone over here. We've got a microphone over there. Would anyone like to ask Edward a question? I forgot to say, by the way, in the introduction, that about 5 different people describe Edward as the inheritor to John le Carré, and if you haven't read his novels, you're in for a real treat. Anybody got a question? Over here, sir.
Some of your novels are on Audible. How do you choose who reads them?
I don't choose. My publisher chooses, and I'm very glad you mentioned it. All of my Audible novels, except one, are read by Richard Attlee, who is the grandson of Clement Attlee, who was actually a colleague of my wife's grandfather. Yeah, so we have the Attlee connection raise its hands, and of course Richard Attlee is more famous for playing. Name some characters from The Archers. No, he's the woman that runs the pub. What's her name?
Her husband.
Yeah, she plays the husband. Yeah. Yes, so he does a fine job of reading my books, even at the end of each chapter, even if he goes dumpty 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 dumpty.
And you've got another book, number 9, is coming out this year, isn't it?
Well, it's coming out. Well, it's totally finished now.
Yeah.
It's down and dusted, and it's called the Farewell Dinner for a Spy, which is a Catesby takes on the French Connection.
Brilliant.
And this is, I wish William and I could have spent this whole hour talking about poetry, since I'm very, very interested in poetry. And I think Allen Ginsberg is a better poet than T.S. Eliot.
That's controversial. That's very controversial.
And Howl is better than The Wasteland. But anyway, be that for some. Okay, Allen Ginsberg has written a poem which he performs called CIA Dope Calypso, which is a history of the CIA's experience in the drug trade. As a matter of fact, the CIA is not an intelligence agency. The intelligence agency stuff is their cover story, their drugs cartel. Everyone knows that. Now, hang on. I saw this in Vietnam. We saw this happening. The mortuary at Da Nang airfield was surrounded by a platoon to protect the mortuary, not to protect the mortuary, but to protect the morticians from other American soldiers who wanted to kill them. And one of the reasons was they were dead American GIs had condoms full of heroin stuck up their backsides to get the heroin back to the States, because and this is a later version, but Catesby encounters the CIA. One character, the CIA head of station in Marseille is really big time into obviously the French Connection, which was, and of course, if you look, where does the CIA involve America in wars? Well, Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Colombia. What do these places all have in common? And anyway, so that's the.
That's the next one, the French Connection. Molly.
When you write books like this that are so complex with the plot, how do you map out your narrative? How do you sort of plant what you know and how you want the line to follow?
I don't, not at all. No, the characters. I let the characters. The characters are in charge, not me. I'm just on the keyboard. That's all I do. I just listen to what the characters say. I know that sounds spooky, but it's not, because as the characters develop, they see what's going on. As a matter of fact, of course, I've been picked out as someone that does a form of writing called docufiction. Have you heard that? Which actually, docufiction actually goes back to the silent cinema. It began in silent cinema in the late 1920s. They would go to, there's a silent film called The Men of Aaron, I think.
Yeah.
Men of Aaron. There's another one called the Nanook of the North, and the filmmakers went, to do these filming these natives, and it didn't work. So what they had professional actors that interacted with the natives, and so you had this combination of real people and actors, and that worked. Well, this is what I do in my books. I've got all these historical characters, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, Richard Nixon, the awful guy, Angleton, James Yosu, I call it the Spanish pronunciation, James Yosu Angleton, who was, terrible, head of counterintelligence, who was part of the Wilson plot. So I got all these real characters, and they interact with purely fictional characters. Which is like those those documentary films. Because if you look at Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's history plays, there are no fictional characters; they're all historical characters. In Hilary Mantel, they're all historical. I know there are other writers that do the docu-fiction thing, but I don't think they do it as well as I do.
Well, on that note, we're going to call it a day. I really recommend these books. They're a terrific read. Edward, thank you for coming over to entertain us on this hot Saturday morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Wilson.
Thank you.